So now the question is, how are we going to fight corruption unless we have to start from people, from our own conscience, and we have to start from basic fairness?
So I completely agree. There's not just one problem to solve. And the problem that I'm talking about, the kind of corruption that I'm talking about, where people allow the wrong influences to guide their lives, is a kind of corruption that we have not just in Congress. We have it with doctors taking money from drug companies and then sitting on panels reviewing drugs. We have it with professors at universities taking money to give public testimony rather than just saying what they think is right on the basis of their expertise. We have it in the financial services industry, where you had the rating agencies that were taking money from the people they were rating rather than being independent of the people they were rating and making a judgment independently. The problem I'm talking about, I agree with you, is everywhere. And it might be too much. It might be impossible, right? It might be that there's no way to solve this problem. But I was asked that question once in directly that form. Is this possible? Is the problem impossible, the way your question makes it sound? And I guess my view is, when that question was asked, I had a vision of my kid, who's just 7 years old. And I thought, what if a doctor said to you that your child had terminal cancer? Nothing you could do about it. Nothing you could do. Would any of us do nothing? Would any of us give up? Because this is the reaction I feel when I hear people tell me, you know, the problem is not just this, it's this and this and this, and there's so many things that are there, and look at the power. The power is so great, there's no way to imagine getting around it. I guess my rational side says, you're probably right. You're probably right. But another side says, that's no reason not to do everything possible to try to prove you wrong. And that's what we have to do here. So I think there is a reason to fight for a system of funding congressional elections that give members the chance to be independent. It's not proving they will be. It's not proving they'll be smart. It's not guaranteeing they won't say some of the crazy things that they say already, but at least gives them the chance to do the right thing. And that's not by a voluntary system completely. What I'm talking about is a law that funds elections publicly, right? So people opt into getting public funding to make it so it's reasonable to run an election like that. I think there's a reason to fight for that. And I do think there's a constitutional strategy here too. I don't think it's about going to Congress and trying to get Congress to pass an amendment. I think anything that depends upon Congress passing an amendment is just hopeless. I can't count to 67 in the United States Senate. I don't think that's possible. But I do think that there's a reason to try to terrify Congress. And the way to terrify Congress is to do the strategy which led to the Senate being an elected body. The only time we have ever gotten Congress to change its own structure was when states began calling for a constitutional convention. And when we were one state away from a constitutional convention, Congress, terrified about this body coming into existence that they wouldn't control, immediately passed 17th Amendment, which created the elected Senate, sent it to the states, and the states ratified it, and that stopped the movement for a constitutional convention. So I think Article 5 actually does give us a strategy here. But it's a strategy that depends upon rallying and teaching people outside of the Beltway how we can reclaim a democracy, and doesn't try to depend on bargaining with people inside the Beltway to get that kind of fundamental change.
Your first $50 project, where is it in the plan? Is it before, during, or part of an amendment? I didn't understand that part of it.
So we have to learn to walk and chew gum at the same time, right? The first $50 project is a completely constitutional bill. It would pass, even the Supreme Court would have no problem with it, because it is voluntary from the standpoint of the members of Congress or the candidates opting into it. And the Supreme Court has affirmed repeatedly that publicly funding elections, like the presidential public funding of elections, is not a problem from a constitutional perspective. So we could pass, if that bill passed, it would be upheld by the Supreme Court, even this Roberts Supreme Court. Now, if the $50 project were enacted, it's still possible, because of Citizens United, that the independent expenditures by corporations would still swamp the system. It's still possible. And so it still might be necessary to take the next step, which is to get a constitutional amendment to effectively limit the ability of that kind of independent expenditures. I'm not sure whether it's necessary, but it might be. But my view is about rational strategy here, right? What is the first thing we should be changing? Because if you produced a Congress where 80% of Congress were elected under this clean money system, you would have a constituency that wants to extend the effectiveness of clean money. You would have at least 80% in that Congress who wanted to make the system work. And they would be more willing to consider the idea of a constitutional amendment to make it work than this Congress ever will. Because this Congress has no incentive to move to that significant alternative system directly or change Citizens United, because they depend so heavily upon that kind of spending. So it's not, my claim is not that an amendment won't be necessary. It's just let's fight the battle that gets us to the place where it's possible, and fight it both inside the Beltway and outside the Beltway, but in a way that drives to that ultimate objective that would change the influence, not just change whether corporations are called persons or not.
Professor Lessig, what is the single most useful thing ordinary citizens can do to get big money out of American politics?
The single most important thing to do is to join organizations and movements that are pushing for this, and there are lots. And that movement at this stage has got to drive towards educating other citizens about this need, and educating more than the people on the left, bringing in people on the right. So the most important thing I think the Tea Party does is they run seminars for other people in their circles to help educate others about what they need to know in order to believe the values that they believe. We need to do the same thing. We need to do the same thing with them. So the most important thing to do right now is not a sexy campaign that's going to end on Capitol Hill screaming and getting Capitol Hill to do something powerful. We're way far away from that moment. We have to educate ourselves first and support candidates that begin to push that education in a useful way. And, you know, frankly, I think if there's a wild card in this story over the next 4 years, it's going to come from the Republican Party. If you imagine a presidential campaign with 7 credible candidates running for president, but a base that believes, as every poll shows that they believe, where 70 to 80 to 85%, depending on the way the question is framed, believe that money buys results in Washington and money is corrupting the political system, there is an enormous incentive inside that dynamic for at least one of them to try to separate him or herself from the rest of the Republicans by being the kind of Republican that Teddy Roosevelt was talking about. And if that happens, and it begins to be at least a credible thing to say if you're a Republican, that you want to find a way to end this kind of influence in Washington, then we have a real chance. So we need to build to a place where we can bring them into the same tent of change without insulting or demanding things that will make it impossible for them to be on the same team.
It was an excellent presentation. The one thing which wasn't talked about so much in there is the fact that a lot of the fights and movements against the funders or the corporate class aren't going through the halls of Congress or through state legislators or even through electoral system. They're kind of fights directly against the funders, you know, like our foreclosure fight or union strikes, for instance. And I'm wondering if you could comment on, and those struggles are often great movement-building moments that kind of then dovetail with strategies like you have. And I'm wondering if you could comment on the possibility of how those kind of direct struggles against the funders can integrate with the kind of strategies you're talking about. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that they're essential. And so the work that you're doing with the Harvard students in Boston is really extraordinary. I don't know if people know about this, but this is a clinic that's basically been created to defend people who are being foreclosed against, or in contexts where the foreclosure shouldn't be going against them. A lot of them are people who are in buildings where they're renting. The building itself is in a position where it's being foreclosed against. And they've been very, very successful, exercising power to get the law to do what the law says it ought to be doing. And that's very important. And I think my objective is not to take people away from different movements. So there are a lot of important movements. There's an environmentalist movement. There is a movement to get really great health care in America. There's a movement for food safety. There's a movement for unions and better worker safety and worker protections. There's all sorts of movements out there. But I think what we have to do is to get those movements to begin to educate their members about how much easier their work would be if this fundamental corruption didn't exist in our system. Now, I think that people on the left, it's a pretty easy thing for them to be convinced of that right now. Right? 2 years ago, everybody was ecstatic. Oh my gosh, we've got Barack Obama. Now we're going to get really important changes in healthcare, and we're going to get real global warming legislation. We're going to get real food safety law. You know, all of these amazing changes that were going to happen merely because Barack Obama was going to woo the world into following him for this. And we've seen blockage in all of these contexts because of this enormous power of money. And so for people who are in the environmentalist movement, when you say to them, look, you need to give us 10% of your time, you know, continue to do your work, but give us 10% of your time to fight this issue too. And if we can get 10% of the environmentalists and 10% of the unions, and we can get 10% of the people fighting for health care and 10% of all of these issues to devote their energy to this issue too, then how much easier will your work be when the only thing you've got to fight is an argument on the other side, not $100 million in lobbying on the other side, right? So we've got to get the movements to recognize how they can't just focus on their own concern. I think, you know, I'm often reminded here of the Niemöller's poem during World War II. You know, first they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't do anything because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the socialists, and I didn't do anything because I wasn't a socialist. And they came for the Jews, I didn't do anything because I was a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was nobody left to do anything for me, right? Well, I kind of think of that sometimes when I think about these different movements, right? First, they came for the global warming people, and I didn't do anything about that because I didn't really care much about global warming. So all of these different groups thinking only about themselves don't recognize that they have to unite to fight the underlying cause, or each of them, one by one, will be taken out by this money. And that's, in fact, I think what we've seen over the last 2 years.
All right, we're going to negotiate with y'all. There's way more questions than we can fit in. We're already actually at the time we're supposed to end. We're reconvening at 7 p.m., but we're going to try something. And I'm going to invite you and everybody else with a question. If you can make your question 10 seconds long, we'll have a minute of questions, after which you can make a closing statement that you can address what you like to address. Is that fair?
We'll see.
We'll see how that goes, huh?
Hi, Professor. My name is Dave Saldana. I'm with the Free Press. We're a media reform organization. Question is that the influence of money and media in politics is incredibly corrupted. And how do we get beyond the media conglomerations that are making millions of dollars off of Citizens United to stand aside and let people talk?
Great question.
With the nation so divided and so many people having constitutional amendments to offer, such as 3 in the electoral reform movement that I know of, Gravel's for ballot initiatives and the right to vote, and this one, could you address the question of constitutional conventions?
How do you explain the fact that people in rural America, like in Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, and Maine, understand corporate power and are passing ordinances saying that corporations have no rights?
Thanks for saying what I've been thinking and a lot of people have been thinking for a long time. Thank you for articulating that. I'm surprised you didn't mention the need for publicly funded elections, or better yet, taking back the airwaves and the need for free airtime for candidates as another remedy. And why did you seem to be against initiatives? Wouldn't it be statewide initiatives? Couldn't those be one way to demand constitutional conventions and put the pressure on that's needed?
I'm interested also in the media issue. If every American citizen could hear what you said today, I think the battle would be won immediately. But how can we get the word out? How can we get the word out if the media is contracting with fewer and fewer individuals and companies controlling it, so that we can let people know what the issues are?
And from Facebook, thank you. Do you think the changes suggested by the Dems to filibuster, to To the filibuster is a good start. To fighting corruption, Jessica Quinn, Waverly, New York, from the Facebook. Okay, your choice.
Okay, so I'm going to put the media questions at the end. Start with the amendments for a convention. One of the interesting strategic points about a constitutional convention is that the Constitution says if 2/3 of the states call for a convention, then Congress has to convene one for the purpose of proposing amendments, which then get sent out to the states and 3/4 have to ratify them. The call for a convention can be for any purpose at all. So some states might call for a convention because they want a balanced budget. Other states might call for a convention because they want to enact publicly funded elections. The possibility for a coalition to drive for a call for a convention is much, much greater than the possibility of a coalition around any particular single idea. And then if there's a convention, you know, this wouldn't be like a staged Democratic convention or Republican convention. This would be a real convention, right? Then there's a period of time, a long period of time, of real deliberation by Americans about these kinds of issues. Now, there's a lot more to how to do it and what it should look like, but I think the point of the question is right. There's a political opportunity with that doesn't exist with the direct call for an amendment. With respect to people who are actually pushing for the statements about corporations have no rights, again, I don't disagree with the legal position that it's crazy to imagine corporations having unalienable rights. You know, they're somehow given to them by God, right? The Declaration of Independence didn't talk about corporations. It was talking about people. And of course, even though it spoke about men, it was meaning not all men, and it certainly wasn't meaning women. But anyway, eventually we got around to understanding it to speak about the kind of people that we're talking about, humans, right, and not corporations. So I'm not against that. All that I'm saying is that if the strategy is exclusively focused on reversing this legal decision, we don't do anything about the underlying economy that has already corrupted our government. So wonderful that we have movements out there that are trying to get states to say that corporations chartered in our state cannot engage in political speech. That's fine. I think wonderful. And because, again, I think building movements is complicated and overlapping. We don't want everybody singing the same song, but we do want lots of people pushing in common directions. That's like the progressives 100 years ago. There were crazy leftists and crazy rightists and people in the middle, prohibitionists. These are all sorts of mix of people, but all of them animated by a single idea that something had gone wrong in our democracy. The question about publicly funded elections, well, I'm feeling both like I succeeded and like I failed. Because the one thing that the people who study language here say is that we can't call this publicly funded elections. If you call it publicly funded elections, it destroys the idea in the minds of 90% of Americans. Okay, so that's why I didn't call it publicly funded elections. But my first $50 project is a system for publicly funding elections, right? Well, the way it works is $50 of federal revenue is turned into a voucher which the voter then allocates. So that allocation then takes that money and sends it to a candidate. And that candidate is a candidate who opts into a system where they agree only to take $50 vouchers or contributions of up to $100 privately. So that's a system that effectively uses up to $6 billion in federal in money to support elections. Now people say, $6 billion, that's a huge amount of money. But look, Cato estimates that last year $90 billion was spent by our government in what they call corporate welfare. $90 billion in corporate welfare. Now, if we could cut that in half, we could pay for my first $50 project for, you know, how many years in each of the years that we cut it in half. So it's $6 billion, a lot of money for you and me, but in the scale of this government, if we could restrain the way the government spends its money, we would actually be doing much better. Why am I against the initiative? Not in theory, in practice. I lived in California for 9 years, and California is the best demonstration of the problem with the initiative process. The problem with the initiative process is you predictably produce insanely complicated initiatives that are designed to be so complicated nobody understands them, and they bypass the ordinary political process and destroy representative democracy. We have a representative democracy. Now, it's not that I don't support what certain initiatives might try to do. It's just I think as a system, they don't turn out to actually strengthen representative democracy. They, in fact, sidestep it. Do I think filibusters change is a great idea? Yeah, it's not enough, right? Changing filibuster rules just raises the price for special interests to block change. It raises the price. But it doesn't raise it so high that they won't still block change. They'll just have to pay more to block change. Okay, so I certainly support filibuster reform, but I don't think that's a substitute for the more fundamental reform. And finally, about media. The problem with media is the same problem that activist groups on the left and the right face. And in my group, Fix Congress First, I sent out a letter to all of our supporters trying to get them to support the Tea Party when the Tea Party was pushing for the end to earmarks. It was the most destructive letter I ever sent to my list. There were more people who signed off the list after that and wrote nasty notes back to me saying how horrible the Tea Party was and we weren't going to listen to anything you say anymore because you said one nice word about the Tea Party, right? And so you understand there's a business model to organizing activist groups. It is to know your base and to speak exclusively to your base and don't ever pretend to talk nicely about anybody outside of your base. That's modern American media, right? So Fox is Fox and MSNBC is MSNBC, and we're all trying to talk to our own little groups, and the project of trying to talk to America is no longer technically feasible given the architecture of media today, right? In 1969, 1/2 of households watched one of 3 television news shows every night. 1/2 of households. We were a nation then. And now it's 1/2 of that number is even watching television news, and the news that they're watching is skewed all across the spectrum from the very far right to the very far left. So it's an extraordinary problem that's not going to be solved anytime soon here. And I do think that the response to how do we solve the media we've got to build the media ourselves is so critical. But this is why Free Press's work has been so important. And I think, if you read, so Josh Silver, the head of Free Press, wrote an extraordinary piece on Huffington Post just last week expressing his enormous depression about all of the losses which Free Press has seen under this new administration. Right? Free Press thought they were going to get everything. They were going to get network neutrality. They were going to get blocking of the NBC-Comcast merger. They were going to get telecom policy consistent with what Barack Obama said he was going to do. He was going to take second stand to nobody on network neutrality, and he was fighting hard to make sure we had diversity in media. He has backed down on every single one of these issues. Why? Because his policy people tell him they cannot afford the battle that AT&T would wage and Comcast would wage and Viacom would wage and NBC would wage in local districts if they don't back down on these issues. So an independent agency, the FCC, and the administration has both signaled that these are issues that they don't really, really care about. And we will never solve that problem until we make it so that votes matter rather than money mattering. And that's the real problem we should focus on. Thank you so much for this opportunity.